Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so thrilled you've joined me this evening for a fabulous story, because I've got a fabulous one for you, and you're really going to enjoy it. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I will never forget the day my father invited Mildred Donahue to our farmhouse for a meal. It was a day that would take my life down a downward trajectory. I had been told that a very nice lady was coming to dinner, but my father seemed rather flustered as he began to prepare the meal long in advance, as if his entire day was devoted to preparing for this very special visitor. My father was behaving enigmatically. Normally he brought ready prepared food from the store in town, or the local delicatessens that made ready-made home-style food very palatable, like mac and cheese and meatballs with pasta, which we would shove into the microwave to heat up, and together with the food on our trays we would eat our meals in front of the television set. After my mother's fortuitous death, we no longer sat at the dinner table as a family, which was very sad indeed. Alas, these days the dinner table resembled a tool shed, as everything but the kitchen sink had somehow found its way on its surface. So even if we wanted to eat at the table, it would be an impossibility unless we cleaned the living room up, and that wasn't going to happen in a hurry. One glance at our home, and you would know unequivocally there was no woman around, for all the feminine touches had long since faded away. I wondered why my father was going to such trouble on account of a complete stranger, and decided to myself that she must be rather important. It never occurred to my naive, rather ignorant mind that my father might have romantic aspirations towards this woman. He could never replace my mother, and my father had assured me of that. Foolishly I had taken him at his word, and I don't doubt he meant it at the time, but loneliness can do strange things to a man. "Your mother, Kurt, was the light of my life," he told me, "and now that light has been so cruelly expunged, so we are going to have to learn to live without her. It means we're going to have to both be very brave, but your mum would not want us to be sad, would she?" I had nodded in agreement through my tears. I knew he was right. My mother would have hated us to bask in our melancholia. "But why did she have to die, Daddy? It's not fair!" I protested, trying to disguise the desperate wail in my voice. I didn't want my father to think I was a big baby. It was only girls that cried, but it was hard not to be upset about her loss. When my father was not looking, I don't mind admitting I would allow a few tears to slip down my cheeks, which I would hurriedly wipe away with a great deal of shame and self-disgust. "Boys don't cry," I told myself again and again. Like a constant mantra, I repeated to myself tirelessly every day. If I ever sensed I was in danger of shedding tears, I would always think about those brave American soldiers that went to fight for our country in Afghanistan, and so forth. They had to be courageous and strong. You never heard of any of them breaking down in tears, so neither should I. "I know it's not fair, Kurt," said my father, taking me into his strong, reassuring arms to give me a warm cuddle. "Who said life was ever fair? Life is a journey, you know, and sometimes, sport, bad things happen to good people that are beyond our control. If I can offer you any solace, sport, there is not a person living on this planet that has not experienced loss of some kind. It is part of the fabric of human nature." He paused for a moment, releasing a huge sigh. "It is a given, sport, that we will all stare into the face of adversity at some point in our lives, and this for us has been our dark time. But we will get through it. I know we will," he said, biting his lips, his eyes looking sad. I got the impression my father's words were self-soothing, like calamine lotion that you put on an inflamed rash. It was as if his words were being spoken to have a tranquilizing effect on the both of us. It seemed to comfort him that he was not alone in his grief, and that everybody else faces storms in their life as well. I am not sure whether this kind of self-talk did indeed ease my father's grievous loss. It certainly did little to appease mine. My pain was personal. Did anyone really comprehend what it was like to lose a mother? I doubted many did. Not at my young, impressionable age, when I needed my mother the most. When you're at rock bottom, you look for anything to make your pain more bearable, even if it's a temporary release, like a band-aid over a cut, that while it remains fixed to the open wound, you pretend it's not there. But sooner or later, the band-aid peels away, and you are faced with the sting of your grief all over again. I think the easiest thing for me was to take each day, one step at a time, so I didn't have to reflect on the past, but focus on the present, like attending to feeding our free-range chickens, and taking a ride on my mother's horse Chloe. In a strange way, when I rode my mother's horse, I felt as if my mother was in the saddle with me. I enjoyed mucking out the stables and brushing the horses' coats until they gleamed. When my mother was alive, I had complained tirelessly about helping her with such chores. "Do I have to?" I'd complain, bunching my eyebrows together. "Yes, you do, sweetheart. It's very good to get one's hands dirty and to work hard. It's good for the soul." After my mother's untimely death, it was those kind of chores I previously rebelled about that became my quintessential lifeline to keep me grounded. I found keeping busy helped me not to focus on my feelings. I could block them out and forget they even existed. My father did much the same. He had his own mechanical workshop on our property. My father was so good with his hands and seemed to understand how to fix anything, from a broken-down toaster to an old piece of farming machinery that had not been used for centuries. People would pay him excellent money to bring back things to life and to their original pristine condition, from antiques to cars and old-fashioned children's toys, Ferris wheels, merry-go-rounds, old candy floss machines. You name it, my father could fix it. My dad's workshop was an Aladdin's cave of treasures that, when he brought back to life, looked as good as new. I'd never believed anyone could do that, but my father was a master at turning a sow's ear into a silk purse. My father fixed up things for people all over America, so his job was not just relegated to the Montana area where we lived. The farmhouse was not the same without my mother's spirited presence, her pretty laughter trilling in the house, or her tuneful voice singing one of her favourite songs. She could sing "The hills are alive with the sound of music," like Maria von Trapp. My mother owned her own guitar and was an incredible singer. Now I would never hear her pretty voice again. When she was young, before she met my father, she would sing for a local band called the Nightingales that travelled around the country. She had 5 passions: music, singing, cooking, horses, and family. We were lucky to live in an idyllic part of the world in Montana. In truth, on the outside, our farmhouse looked like a dreamy picture on a box of Swiss chocolates, especially with the sculptural mountains in the backdrop, their undulating surfaces blistered with blankets of snow. Furthermore, the rolling countryside was so often richly carpeted with a plethora of alpine wild flowers that would cover the hilltops with their breathtaking ensemble of colourful displays. And under a perfectly blue Montana sky, the views were quite literally eye candy for those who appreciate great beauty in all its forms. We'd often see great birds of prey sailing the clouds, most commonly the bald eagle, and I loved to watch those birds, as there was something so magisterial about them. My father told me that at one point in time the bald eagle was almost extinct here in Montana, but had made an extraordinary comeback. After my mother died, a bald eagle came and rested on the banisters of our wraparound porch for several days, until my mother's funeral was over. That had never happened before or since. I always felt the eagle was carrying a message from my mother, telling us all was well. I know my mother loved bald eagles, so it made perfect sense she would use a bird of prey like this to convey a message to us. My father was a perennial cynic, but even he had to admit that our feathery visitor, after my mother's death, was more than a little idiosyncratic. Our property boasted a plethora of tall, lofty trees, and so many of them clustered together in happy groups, dappling the countryside with their viridescent resplendence. Behind our stable block on the left-hand side of the valley, where the hill flattened out, it eventually met up with a large wood grove that was so vast that I'd never actually explored the whole depth of it. It was a fabulous haven for so much indigenous wildlife. I often saw wolves on our property, coyotes, bears, and deer. Our two-story asymmetrical farmhouse, with its distinctive gable in the front of the house and large sash windows throughout, possessed an endearing rustic charm, and its wraparound porch that hugged the house overlooked the man-made silvery lake my father had created, that was surrounded by a plethora of weeping willows and abundant bird life. My father had planted those weeping willows before I was even born, and some of them had grown substantially big. On the surface, our lives looked so picture-perfect and even enviable for anyone looking at us from the outside in, and it certainly was for a long time, and would have unequivocally remained that way if my mother was still around. But without her, so much magic in our lives had been vaporized like the steam from a kettle, and me and my dad missed her terribly. I would often catch him studying photograph albums of my mother and quickly closing them when I entered the room. I think he found it easier not to talk about her, because when we did, we would feel so sad. My parents had a cherished relationship. They loved the bones of each other and could finish each other's sentences. Suffice to say, after my mother was gone, the once sumptuous, cosy living room that in previous years had been a showstopper now resembled a yard shed, rather than a comfortable place to sit by the fire after a hard day's work. At one time every room in our house had been well appointed and sparkled like a brand new pin, with gleaming furniture, perfectly polished, fresh vases of flowers strewn around the place elegantly, bright colourful scatter cushions on our settees to lend a splash of vibrancy to everything. I regret to say that these days there was dust over every hard surface, that in some places was so bad I'd been able to write my name on the old bookshelf in the entrance hall, for example, and the grandfather clock looked very sorry for itself and was always an hour and a half ahead in time, as if it too had rebelled against my mother's untimely demise. There were silken webs on the ceilings, where spiders had been able to make homes for themselves without the interfering intrusion of my mother's long feather duster, and instead of a bowl of fruit on the living-room table, there was a box of termite killer, a reel of wire, a hammer, a box of nails, some packets of seedlings from leeks to cabbages to celery, and a huge pile of old newspapers. Gone was the wistfully nostalgic scent of lavender wood polish mixed in with the sweet bouquet of fresh flowers, and the smell of freshly baked cinnamon buns my mother made every Sunday morning without fail. Those were no more. These days there were jackets strewn haphazardly over the couches, and most of my mother's scatter cushions were flung to the floor like water lilies across a pond. If my mother could see the sorry state of things now, I imagine she'd be turning in her grave. I had visions of her staring at us through the clouds with a microscopic lens, and doing flip-flops over the clouds to express her frustration, for she would have loathed to see us living in such a chaotic mess, which she would have unequivocally described as pandemonium and nothing less. Our cat Sullivan, a ginger and white marmalade, with big wide green eyes, stared with bemusement at the chaos around him. He was having to perch on a pile of newspapers on the chair, as his special place had been confiscated by my father's mess. He was not best pleased by the rapid decline in living standards, and the broiled chicken my mother used to make him daily had been replaced with tin stuff, which he had turned his nose up to for a long while, until hunger had got the better of him, and he realized that he better eat the tin stuff or he might have to go hungry. My mother had died 2 years prior, from a nasty fall from her beloved horse Chloe. My father believed that Chloe got spooked by something, and came running back to our farm, with her saddled back unoccupied, and my mother nowhere to be seen. My father at once knew something was terribly wrong, and the flustered horse seemed quite disquieted. If she could speak, she would tell us what had happened. My father had rushed out on his ATV to see if he could find the whereabouts of my mother, and there she was, lying on the earthen trail, completely lifeless. The coroner said she had bashed her head so hard on the ground and had died instantly. I suppose that was a relief. At least she didn't suffer. The news hit our family hard, and in our small rural American town there was not a dry eye in the church, as my mother had been loved by the community and had often been the lead singer in the church choir. My father had not taken her death well, so his sister Liz had moved into our farmhouse for the first year to help him get back on his feet again. In truth, she had been a lifesaver to our lives, buttressing me and my father up with her encouraging words. She had taken care of us with fabulous meals and been a listening ear for us when we needed to talk. My father would never have shared his grief with anyone, but he could confide in his sister Liz. They were incredibly close. Liz had tirelessly told my father that my mother would not want him to be alone forever, and that was true. My mother's dog Pluto, who had been attached to my mother when she was alive, had now decided to adopt Liz as her new owner. She liked females. She had been a rescue from a shelter whom had been abused by a man. So when Liz moved out of our farmhouse and returned to her cottage close to the town, Pluto, the border collie mix, went with her. So once they were both gone, the farmhouse had become an incredibly lonely place. There were times I would walk into the house and hear nothing at all, and the silence was deafening. So on this day, when my father had invited a guest for dinner, he was bustling around the kitchen. I noticed there was a spring in his step, and he was whistling happily to himself under his breath. The radio was blaring in the background. I was about 10 at the time, but I sensed something very different about my father's demeanour, as if the heavy cloud of despair that had hung around his life for so long, like a suffocating dog's choker chain, had finally been lifted. The last time he was in a remarkably good mood like this was when my mother was alive. I should have put two and two together and read between the lines, but perception was not exactly my strong point. I was glad to see my father happy like this, but I thought he was finally coming to terms with my mother's death. Our trauma counsellor had told us that we would soon emerge from the black fog like a phoenix from the ashes. Was this what was happening to my dad? I wish some of the golden magic that had touched him would rub off on me, because although I was a resilient kid, my mother's death was not easy to overcome, and it still got me down a great deal of the time. I watched him with an inquisitive curiosity as he peeled potatoes vigorously, soaking them in salted water and pounding 3 steaks with a mortar. My father was a little out of his depth in the kitchen. There was flour all over his apron. He was wearing an apron that had once belonged to my mother. Sweat seemed to be trickling down his brow, which he wiped away with the back of his hand, as he followed my mother's old recipe book with step-by-step precision. I remember thinking he looked a little frantic, rather flustered, like a pigeon narrowly escaping a run-in with the household tabby. My father kept looking nervously at the kitchen clock on the wall and running around the kitchen like a headless chicken, barely stopping to draw breath. The smells from the kitchen were lovely, but my father let out a huge moan when he discovered the cake he had made had flopped. For a first attempt it wasn't bad. It smelt amazing, but it was crisp at the edges and very flat in the middle, like a large vanilla cookie. He quickly prized his cell phone out of his pocket to phone his sister Liz. The expression on his face was one of total exasperation.
"Hi, Liz. It's me, Russell. No, it's a disaster. Everything has gone wrong. The recipe is disastrous." His voice wailed down the phone. "The cake has flopped. It didn't even bother to rise. It turned into a crisp vanilla cookie. It tastes nice, but it's not a cake. I wanted everything to be perfect tonight."
My father had the phone on speaker, so I heard the whole conversation he was having with Liz. "Calm down, Russell, will you? Honestly, you're acting like it's the end of the world. I'm sure you could break the cake up, cover it with custard and jam. The woman won't know any better. Throw in some strawberries. It'll be just fine. Put it into little dessert glasses. Cover it with whipped cream. It'll turn out to be a trifle. I'm sure it'll be delicious, Russell. Some of the biggest cock-ups have become sensational recipes, you know, like that Eton mess, when someone accidentally crunched up meringues with cream and fruit. It's now a popular dessert, but it was born about by a mistake, you know.
But I followed every step of the recipe. Why did the cake not rise? Said my father obsequiously.
Well, a cake won't rise if you don't put any raising agents in it, like baking powder or self-raising flour. Did you use that? What did the recipe ask you for? My father groaned as he looked at the recipe book.
You're right, Liz. I put in flour instead of self-raising flour. How could I be so stupid? I didn't actually know there was a difference. How was I expected to know something like that?
Don't deride yourself, Russell. This is your first attempt at baking a cake. I think you've done remarkably well in the circumstances. I need to remind you that now that you've finished preparing the food, you should lay that table nicely. And then you need to clean up that living room of yours. Dust the furniture really well. Remove all the newspapers and stuff that are littering up the place. You know, since I left, I don't mean to speak unkindly, but your place looks like a bomb's hit it. If you want to impress this lady, you need to clean it up nicely and lay the table with some fresh flowers in the centre, and a couple of candles wouldn't hurt either. Would you like me to come over and lend a hand? I don't mind.
That won't be necessary, Liz, but thanks all the same. I think I will turn the cake into a trifle like you suggested. I simply can't go through the trouble of making another cake. I'll be tearing my hair out if I go through that mayhem again.
I'm sure it'll be delicious, Russell, and good luck, although I doubt you need it. If that woman can't see what a treasure you are, she needs her head examining, that's for sure.
Thanks, Liz, said my father, ending the call, looking decidedly more optimistic. Sport, he said, looking at me brightly. Do you fancy giving me a hand getting this place to look halfway decent? How about dusting some of those cobwebs away from the ceiling? I nodded and got to work, helping my father polish furniture, throwing out old newspapers. I was surprised by the transformation of our home. It almost looked like old times, and the smells coming from the kitchen were absolutely delicious, and my stomach was churning. My father had turned his disastrous dessert into a delicious-looking trifle, and the biscuit texture of the cake was absolutely amazing. He had given me a bowl to get my approval. So what do you think, sport? And don't lie to me to make me feel better. There's still time to go to town and pick up a pecan nut pie if needs must. I tasted my father's custard with strawberries, jam and biscuit-textured cake, and it was delicious. I'm not lying, Dad, but this is amazing. Much better than pecan nut pie any day of the week. My father sighed with relief. I never knew how tough it was to cook, he said. I smiled at this, coming from a man who could turn trash into treasure. It was more than a little amusing for me. That evening my father had dressed immaculately, wearing a navy blue turtleneck top and a smart pair of cream-coloured chinos. My father was a good-looking man, with dark hair that had turned silver after my mother died, but the hair looked good on him. My Auntie Liz called him a silver fox. When we heard the sound of a car rolling up our driveway, my father looked decidedly nervous. He then turned to me and said, Sport, I want you to be very nice to Mildred Donahue. I want you to make her feel very welcome in our home. Can you do that for me? It would make me very happy. Of course, Dad, I said. I must have been dopey for a 10-year-old kid. I still hadn't figured out why my father wanted to impress Mildred Donahue so much. How could I have been such a complete idiot? It was so obvious why my dad had invited this woman around. I soon understood the sober, discomposing truth when my father asked Mildred into our house, and they clandestinely exchanged knowing looks that suggested there was an intimacy between them. Worse still, I could tell at once that Mildred was quite taken by my father, and was swooning over him like a vulture over a dead carcass, and she was not subtle about her obvious infatuation towards him. It made me want to be violently sick. They both knew each other much better than I imagined.
When Liz had come to the house to babysit me, when my father was conveniently indisposed, she told me that Dad needed to work late into the night in his workshop, and that had been a masterful ruse, to keep me off the scent, I suspect, as to what was really going on. Was my father all the time really out and about, painting the town red with this woman Mildred Donahue? I suspected that this was the case. I may have been 10, but I wasn't a complete idiot. I could tell at once that my father liked Mildred in a romantic way, as when she flirted with him coquettishly, his eyes twinkled in response with delight. My blood ran cold, my back stiffened, as I realized in this horrifying moment that maybe my father was intending to replace my late mother with this mousy-looking woman. What did he even see in her? From the get-go I'd noticed something very insidious about her, but then I suppose I would automatically see her as the enemy, even if she had been a perfect angel, which she certainly was not. I felt an anger shoot through me like a firework on the 4th of July, but I did my level best to keep my emotions in check. I saw my father's obvious friendship with Mildred as an absolute betrayal to my mother's memory. My mother had been a vibrant personality in life, but Mildred was as dowdy as a pair of antique, mismatched tan-coloured socks lying in my father's drawer, littered with holes. There was nothing remotely special about her, and when she smiled at me, her smile was not genuine, and didn't even meet her cold, dark eyes that I could sense were calculating and mean. The worst part of it all was the moment that Mildred laid eyes on me. I could see she despised me already. "Oh, so this is your son Kurt, is it?" she said to my dad, with a large fake smile on her face that I did not buy for a single second. "It's so nice to meet you, Kurt. Your father's told me all about you. And don't worry, it's all good stuff. So tell me, young man, how old are you?" "I'm 10, I said stiffly. I didn't like anything about this woman at all, and when she looked at me, her eyes were predatory, not kind. "You're 10, are you? Oh, what a lovely age. Well, I suppose you can have your whole life ahead of you when you're that young. But of course you don't know very much at your age. You've got a lot of growing up to do still. But still, it's a lovely age, isn't it? 10. I can't remember what I was like when I was 10. I remember the dinner had been a painful, laborious affair. I say that because my besotted father could not keep his eyes off Mildred. I mean, was he as blind as a bat? It was as if he thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Could he not see that she had a pointed beak-like nose, like a bald eagle, which looks good on a bird of prey, I will admit, but not on a lady? Could he not see how treacherously cold and vindictively spiteful she was? Everything about her was far from pretty. Her hands were big like a man's, even though she had those fancy nails you get from hours spent at the nail salon. They didn't hide how masculine her hands were. My mother never had nails like that. They'd have stopped her from efficiently doing her jobs around the house and from playing the guitar. I couldn't imagine Mildred being very industrious. She looked like the kind of lazy woman who enjoyed being waited on hand and foot. My father seemed happy to oblige her every request. It was pathetic. If love turned you into a useless bowl of jello, I wanted no part of it when I got older. This woman didn't come close to my mother. What on earth did my dad see in her? The meal was a success as far as my dad was concerned, and to give my father his due, the food was delicious. Although if I'm being entirely picky, the potatoes were not as crisp as my mother's would have been. But the dessert was a rip-roaring success. "This trifle, Russell! It is quite the most delicious trifle I have ever tasted. The cake is so crisp. You've got to give me this recipe." My father gave me a wink, and we both smiled, remembering the disaster in the kitchen earlier on in the day with the flat cake. It wasn't such a disaster after all. It was shortly after this dinner that my life began to change exponentially,
as Mildred weaved her way masterfully into our lives. And before I knew it, my father was married to the witch, and my life was never the same after that, after she had bamboozled her way into our lives, taking charge and ensuring that my father was completely wrapped up under her spell. And it would seem he was. My father falsely believed the sun shone out of Mildred's backside. He was obliviously unaware that there was a dark, insidious, vindictive side to her character. My dad had no idea how badly Mildred treated me. Even if I had told him as much, he'd never have believed my account. For in his dewy eyes, Mildred was as sweet as honey. The duplicitous woman turned on the charm when he was around, and was sweet to me in front of him, inquiring after my day and asking if I wanted another scoop of ice cream. When my father wasn't there, she'd tear me apart like a bird of prey, without any remorse whatsoever, so that I lived in fear of that woman every day of my life, from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to bed at night. Mildred made no secret of the fact that she loathed me. What a pity you weren't a girl, Kurt, she complained capriciously. I can't stand little boys. When your father told me that you were a boy, oh my word, I was so bitterly disappointed. But when I met you, things were so much worse than I could have ever envisaged. It's a pity your father came with baggage at all. You're not a chip of the old block, are you? My bet is you take after your dreadful mother, and what an awful woman she was. My mother was not dreadful. She was much nicer than you, prettier too. You're ugly and plain, I told her. How dare you, Kurt? Go to your room now. I don't want to hear another word out of your poisonous mouth. Of course you think your mother was great. You're her progeny after all. And don't I know it, she said contemptuously. When my father was not around, she treated me like the turd on her shoe. I was very intimidated by Mildred. She scared me. The woman was capable of anything. She didn't like our marmalade cat, Sullivan. I caught her slipping rat poison in Sullivan's food once. I clandestinely threw the contaminated food away and sneakily replaced the rat poison with icing sugar, and Mildred eventually gave up trying to kill the cat after she couldn't understand why the rat poison wasn't working, as Sullivan simply refused to die. Furthermore, Sullivan didn't want to touch the sweet food that he was presented, so I fed him discreetly behind her back, and Sullivan never ever took anything from her again, and viewed her with a great deal of suspicion. I can't stand your cat, she barked at me. Dreadful creature! Can't see what people see in them, I really can't. They should all be slaughtered and turned into scarves. I wish that bloody cat would die. I knew she wasn't a good person to hate animals so much. She even complained about the indigenous wildlife that visited our property, and saw no beauty in the bald eagles that sailed in the skies above our heads. Thankfully she liked my father's horse, and Chloe, my mother's horse, was her absolute favourite. I knew Mildred did not only wish the cat was dead, but she would have liked me out of the way as well, so that she could have my father all to herself. If she could have put drain fluid in my Kool-Aid, she probably would have done so, but Mildred was not stupid. She'd never do anything that might jeopardize her relationship with my father. One day, when it was very hot, with scorching, unforgiving temperatures due to an unmerciful heat wave, Mildred told me we were going to the shops and that I was to come with her. The air conditioning in the car was thankfully on at full blast, so it wasn't an altogether unpleasant trip to the store. If I behaved myself, maybe I could ask Mildred to buy me an ice cream. Mildred could sometimes be nice, but those moments were very rare. Everyone was wearing shorts and T-shirts, fanning themselves vigorously and complaining bitterly about the insufferable weather. When Mildred had parked her car in the parking bay at the store, I was expecting to come in with her, as it would be ridiculous for me to stay in the car in this blistering cruel weather. Instead, Mildred locked me in the car, telling me she'd be only a few minutes. I won't be long. I don't need you tagging along, slowing me down, Kurt, so you need to wait in there. But it's hot in the car. Shut your mouth, young man, and do as I tell you. I knew better than to argue with Mildred, as there was no telling what she would do to me if I continued to challenge her. So I did what she said and obediently remained in the car. I felt like I was an egg being thrown on a frying pan that was beginning to cook. Once the air conditioning was switched off, the car became a sauna. Let's just say every minute was insufferable as the soaring temperatures got hotter and hotter and hotter. In the beginning it was tolerable, but as the heat escalated, I found myself struggling to breathe, as if the breath in my lungs was being stolen from me, as if I was drowning. I was consuming much less oxygen because of the heat molecules that were dispersing in the air, which invariably causes you to suffocate. This is how people die in hot cars. I should have bashed the car window and crawled out, because every locked window in the car was tightly shut. But I was terrified of what Mildred would do to me. She had a waspish tongue. She'd likely tell my father that I'd bashed the window out of spite, and that would make my father angry. Mildred could be very persuasive if needs must. I knew the consequences of climbing out of this car would be bad. Mildred was taking her time. Why was she being so long? If she took any longer in the stall, I would pass out from the heat. I knew I would. I could feel sweat pouring down the back of my legs, trickling down my back and face. And then I began to shut my eyes. I could feel myself almost floating away. I was jolted awake with a woman ramming on my window. "Are you all right, young man? Are you all right? Are you all right?" She looked alarmed. At that moment, Mildred came out of the store, carrying a large grocery bag in her arms. "What are you doing?" she challenged the lady. "Get away from my car, will you? Is that your son in the car?" The woman screamed, pointing her finger accusingly at Mildred. "Your son is dying in there! He's dying! What kind of a monster are you? The temperature today is a killer, and you leave your son in a hot car? He's dying!" Mildred pushed past her and opened the car door, letting in some much-needed air, while the woman threatened to call the police. "I'm calling the police! You are sick! You are sick! Get over yourself!" said Mildred. Once she had thrown her grocery bag on the back and parked herself on the seat, she pulled down the driver's side window and glared at the woman. "Now run along, will you? You're spoiling the scenery." The woman just gawked at Mildred, shaking her head in disgust, as if she couldn't believe anyone could be that vindictive. It was clear that no one like Mildred had ever crossed her path before. The cool waves of the air conditioning system brought me back to life as Mildred pressed her foot on the gas and drove away. I knew in that moment I had come a hair's breadth away from dying that day. So there you are. That's part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and there's an incredible Bigfoot encounter, so don't miss out on it. Until next time, goodbye and good night.